Okay, uh, how is it going, everyone? This is your friendly neighborhood Kamiko Z Kenny coming at you with the next presentation that I have for software testing. Um, I rewrote, so I wrote down a lot of the things that we covered. So I'm going to show you this here. Up here was the things that I wrote down on the previous presentation as we were going through them on things that need to be learned. I decided to go through them and actually prioritize them from um, least logical to, most logical to least logical. Um, we don't really want to get into some of the more complex stuff until later. Right now, it's just kind of a big training exercise, right? Training after exercise after training exercise. You do a lot of training exercises before you handle really uh, important things, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but um, understanding the theory of the craft will go a long way in helping train you to pick up on aspects of the craft as you work. Um, I'll come back to that a little bit more later as we get into this, but I basically rewrote these as these, and there was one that I changed or took out. Um, I put in was it test case management? Yeah, I put in test case management because a lot of those jobs did talk about test cases, reading, writing, maintaining, executing, those kinds of things. And I just didn't write it down. But there was one in here that wasn't really necessary. Trying to think of what it was though. Anyway, compare the two lists. I'm sure you can find out which one it was. But I removed it. Just really not necessary. Really not needed. Um, I think it may have been specifications. Like hardware behavior is important, but like knowing the specs of hardware, unless you're doing performance testing, isn't really a huge deal. So without knowing what the hardware is doing, you can still make a lot of good determinations and guesses on what's going on. So yeah, so we're going to cover methodologies of development in this lesson. Next will be test case management, and then bug management, mobile knowledge, and this is very vague. It's basically how you would use a mobile device to do testing. So kind of like lesson one, but applied to a mobile device. And then we'll get into something scripting. This isn't necessarily the same as programming. They can be intertwined and involved, but they're not. I wouldn't call them the same thing. Databases would be the next logical step because in databases you have queries or scripts that you can run, and it's not. I mean, depending on the database we're talking about, it's not nearly as complex as programming can be. Programming at the beginning is very I don't want to say simple or easy. That's not correct. It's watered down. It's the best way I can explain it. Is just at first it's almost nothing. A lot of the questions that come up are, well, why would you even do that? I can do that by myself in my head. Why would I write a program to do it for me? And so for the most part, programming at the beginning just feels pointless until you get into some of the more nitty gritty aspects of it. Anyway, then we'll go into some automation. So if we know a little bit of programming, we can get into some automation. From there, we can start expanding out and looking at what networking is, what networking does, how you can apply really all of these things to networking, and how knowing about networking helps with different layers of all of these. And then lastly, hardware. We'll take everything that we've learned, everything that we've gone over, and we'll talk about hardware and how it applies to hardware and why hardware is a good thing to know about. But again, it's not like super important. Honestly, in the past, I've put hardware at the very top, at the very beginning, because it's the most readily available non-controversial information that's available. Like if you go and learn um, Python programming from like 8 different websites, they're all going to have a different reason and way of teaching you things. But hardware, it's a little bit more, it's not just a little bit, it's actually quite a bit more straightforward. Um, you don't really call a monitor anything other than a monitor. Uh, and depending on how it's set up, you can call a method a function, or a call, not really a class, but depending on the programming language, you kind of have to set things up very differently. So in the past, I've focused more on hardware, and I'm just going to skip that. Some people get to hardware, and some of the information just doesn't matter. It doesn't really seem to click with them, so they just ignore it. So we're going to try it a little bit differently this time, see how it works. Anyway, so this lesson today is for methodologies of development. Where am I? I am here. Okay. Okay, methodologies of software development. There's no wrong way. Maybe. You got some purists out there that'll say this is the best software development methodology, and maybe for their scenario they're right, but for all scenarios, it just doesn't exist. Like saying there's a perfect vehicle out there that gets the best gas mileage and has the best all-terrain capabilities and has the right weight ratios and it's just and the right source of fuel. Like it doesn't exist. It depends on what you're doing, right? You probably wouldn't take a Prius out bouldering. I would, because I would want to destroy a Prius because I don't see much point to them. But people drive them because they see a point to it. So there's no wrong way unless the way you're doing it is not the way that your company would best benefit. And we'll talk about what that means here. Okay, so the terminology we're going to go over a lot in this lesson is sprint or iteration, velocity, agile, waterfall, Kanban, Scrum. Okay, there are some others that we're going to talk about, but these are you hear about these a lot. The other ones you kind of hear about, but they're more or less in passing. They're a bit fleeting conversations. Also, I'm hoping to keep this video, like I've already been talking 8 minutes. It doesn't feel like I've been talking 8 minutes. It feels like I've been talking for 2. Anyway, so I know that my estimations, I guess that's another one. Let me my estimation is just horrible. It's not good at all. And so while I'd like to keep it under 30 minutes, it's probably going to be close to an hour. I hope not an hour and a half. I apologize if it's longer than an hour. Okay. So talking about each one, sprint or iteration, just think of it as a time-boxed piece of work. So let's say, to help break down your work, let's refer to a house. Okay, let's say we're building a house. There are lots of things that go into building a house, right? You have to find the piece of land. You have to get some surveying done to see if you can build there, if it will fall under like a flood zone, or if there will be some other environmental issue with being there. And then once you actually start building it, you have to dig the right specs for the foundation. You have to pour the foundation. You have to drill your mounts into the foundation after it dries to attach the rest of the house to, the body of the house to. You have to put up the framework for it, the framing of the house, and then you start attaching, or then you start running, cables and piping throughout it, and then you start covering all that up with things to make it look pretty and nice. And if you're going to be doing such a big project like that, it's sometimes good to meet and talk about the work that's going to be happening, and then you end up either accidentally or on purpose breaking off chunks of work to go about. Like, you're going to do the foundation first, and the foundation includes these 8 things, whatever those 8 things are. And then the next part is, okay, well, that seemed to work. What are the next 8 things we can bring in? And let's say it takes 3 weeks for the first 8 things. So you say, okay, 3 weeks is a good amount of time for us to work together, plan everything out, and get it executed. So we're going to work in 3-week increments until the house is built. And that's essentially what a sprint or an iteration is. It's a defined time box for work of a given project. The project is building the house. And you might go through 18 sprints. You might go through 2 sprints, depending on size and quality of the house. But that's what a sprint or an iteration is, just a time box of work. Velocity is during a sprint or an iteration, you're working at a particular pace. Some people are super enthusiastic when they're carrying around bags of cement, and other people walk slow. However, the people who walk fast, let's say that they're bad at mixing concrete. You have all these kind of specialized skills and tasks where, given what people are good at over a period of time, it determines the likelihood of finishing certain products or projects in an overall aspect. I know that's super strange and abstract, but that's kind of what a velocity is your team's capability of completing work in a measurable period of time. Another velocity is often used in speed for cars or running. So if you run 6 miles an hour, that's your velocity. You go 6 miles every hour. And suppose you can get 6 hours of work done in an 8-hour time span. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it will here in a minute. That would be your velocity. It's 6 hours of work per day. Okay, Agile. Agile is actually a methodology of development. So don't think about things like agility. The following names are horrible for sharing definitions with the other words that they're assigned to, like agility. Agile is not an actual agile process. People would argue that it is. It's really not. Waterfall is another methodology, has nothing to do with waterfalls at all. I guess the visualization is maybe close to it, but there are a lot of things that when dropped from a height will fall. Don't know why it has to be water. Kanban is a way of work assignment. Think of it like a conveyor belt of work. Say you work in a factory. If you have a conveyor belt of work that's coming to you all the time, you're basically doing Kanban. It's just a steady flow and influx of work. Scrum is a little bit more ratioed out work, and it's a little bit more specific. So an example of Scrum would be like, let's say that for every Prius that is ordered, the person who owns it has their name written on the side of the car to brag that they own a Prius, or to target them for owning a Prius. Scrum would be getting that car and having to look up and figure out the style and placement of the name on every car. It's not a steady influx or stream. There's a definite pause and break period between pieces of work. And that's kind of what Scrum is. Estimation is exactly as it sounds. This isn't a methodology. This is just something I remembered last minute, where you say, okay, well, you want to pour the foundation for this house. Okay, well, based off of the size, the amount of cement that we have, and the capabilities of our crew, we can pour the base, or we can pour the foundation and have it dry in 12 days. And suppose there's inclement weather in between then, and it takes 16 days. That would be an indication of someone with uh, poor estimation practices. Not necessarily poor estimation, because it could actually take 12 days of work with 4 days of weather, but it's those kinds of delays that are looked for in people who are good at estimating in a development perspective. Anyway, okay. So if you know what Agile and Waterfall are, you'll be mostly golden. There are a whole bunch of different methodologies for software development. There's a spiral, chaos, test-driven, behavior-driven development. Primarily, you'll see Agile and Waterfall. The other ones will come up, but they'll come up as sub methodologies that exist within Agile or Waterfall. Like, we're an Agile house that does test-driven development, or we're a Waterfall house that does chaos development, and sometimes they can be paired off like that. You don't ever have like an Agile Waterfall environment, because they're two very different understandings and methodologies. So Agile, it primarily identifies frequent points of conflict and assigns pre-prioritization to them. I'll show you what that means on the next slide. Waterfall, it relies on all the planning to be super well defined super early in the process. This is good for very mature companies with very good designers, very good modelers of work, very good sales expectations, and communicators of needs. Waterfall is tremendous for those kinds of environments. For groups that have like a high turnover rate, so you got a lot of people coming in and out often because of competitiveness in the industry, Agile works really, really well in those kinds of scenarios. But if you've had the same team for like 10 years and you're doing Agile, you're probably wasting 30% of your time doing this over this. Okay. Waterfall. Okay. Basics of Waterfall is that ideally it does save the most time. However, it's almost never the ideal time, which makes it kind of hard to rely on. The nice thing about it is that it does allow for a lot of uninterrupted development to take place. So to kind of give you an idea of what Waterfall is. So we're going to go back. I don't know why I'm thinking about Priuses today. Maybe it's subliminal and I really want to buy a Prius. But let's say that in a waterfall development scenario, somebody will draw out the next version of Prius, right? They'll have a design for it. They'll take it to someone and say, hey, I got this design. What do you think? And they'll take a look at it and go, gosh, I love this. Do you think that because of the way that the doors are placed or the wheels are placed, that we could maybe do some under the hood things like this and this? And then someone will go through and draw the blueprints and the instructions for the Prius. And after those two people collaborate and go, yeah, this is great, they'll go on to the next person. The next person is more or less the can we implement this in the current build cycle of cars? And they'll take a look at it and go, okay, well, based off of all these parts and all these things, okay, this is like 20% different than an actual current Prius. So based off of that, it's going to take this much time before we get used to it, and this much time before it actually becomes effective, then another this much time before it becomes profitable. Yeah, okay, I like that. Let's do this. And they'll basically take each piece and add it together like Legos. Or you ever see that scene from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, when they're all chewing gum trying to get the antenna pieced together and fixed on the phone booth, and they keep adding to the ball of gum as they go down the line? It's like that. So you add to it as you go down the line, and then once it gets to the developer, you have this really well thought out, well presented, well designed piece of instruction, and then you give it to the developer, and then you leave them alone. You say, okay, I understand that you're going to be working on this for the next 3 months to get us the first prototype. So we're going to leave you alone for 3 months. We're going to come back in 3 months and see how things are going. But until then, we're just going to leave you to it. And then they go away. And that developer has the next X amount of time, in this case, 3 months, to work on that prototype Prius. And then in the end, when they come back after 3 months and go, how's it going? Then they can come back and say, okay, well, why isn't this working the way we thought? Why isn't this doing what it's supposed to? And then they can have another design discussion based off of how things are going. Usually, though, at the end of those 3 months, some sort of prototype will be delivered, and it's almost never what is expected or wanted. And so then there's another 3 month time span or 2 month time span to get the next thing done. But it's in the same kind of mode. They take what currently is, and then they'll make notes and memos and markings in the margins, and they'll get all these notes and everything, and they'll compile it back. They'll go from design to architecture to business and planning, and they'll go down the line and add more crap to it. And then they'll hand it to the developer and say, okay, I know this is what you have. We need all these other little tweaks around it. So we're going to give you a month to work on those tweaks. And that's kind of what waterfall is you bunch a bunch of stuff together and you hand it to a developer and say, work on this for a long time. We'll come back later and check on you. And in that time, those people are working on other designs or doing other estimates for other products, or they're trying to see if the market is responding well to the idea of the product that you're currently prototyping, or they're going out trying to find contracts for people that want to buy that thing, so that you can start getting some sort of cash flow in before you've even made the product. That happens a lot, and it's often a point of conflict between the tech side of things and the business side of things, is that they tend to sell what doesn't exist yet. Sorry, there's an ice cream man trolling the neighborhood, and it just feels like a Stephen King book right now. Because with things going the way they are, it just feels like they're going around handing out infections. Anyway, maybe that's intentional. So yeah, that point of conflict of, we haven't even made it yet, it's not even in an alpha, and you've sold it, and now you've committed the company's reputation to something that isn't even close to being done. But for the sake of business, because you are in a business, it's a step that kind of has to happen. It's just super inconvenient from a developer perspective because it puts a lot of pressure on them. Like a developer who works at a company, they don't go into the company thinking, oh man, F this company. I don't ever want these guys to succeed. I am so looking forward to being unemployed in 6 months. No, it doesn't happen. If it does, those people aren't hired or kept around for very long. Not because the company goes under, but because they quickly show that they're not a team player. So the developer is just as invested in the company's success, but it puts a lot of extra pressure on them. And often what ends up happening is that you get into something called a death march. And I'm not going to write death march down. It's because it's just as it sounds. It's you're there a lot. You're at work, working way past the 40-hour-a-week typical threshold, and you're lucky if you get to see your family in between shifts. It's like being an on-call doctor during the COVID-19 epidemic. It stinks to go on a death march. And so when you get very overzealous business people who don't understand enough about the tech side, they can really paint the company into some really terrible corners. And that's the selling side is necessary, but there's a point where you need to stop. And waterfall is terrible with managing those kinds of expectations, because it really is at the very end, you get the product, and whatever it is has to work. Because if it doesn't, you don't have any time left to fix it. And that's bad. um, anyway, so uh, Waterfall, it's more like a grocery store than a restaurant. Before you really get into it, you have a good, clear picture of all the things that you're going to be using before you get into it. A restaurant, you kind of go there and you have an idea in your mind, but you're not holding the ingredients. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of where that differs. It used to be the best thing to do things until Agile came along. I don't think that Agile is any better than Waterfall, but a lot of people seem to like it. Agile. Okay. Agile claims to be very flexible, and it's almost never used in that way. The thing is that Agile basically says uh, you can do anything you want and call it Agile. And so you can actually do Waterfall and call it Agile because Agile says you can. And so when people say, yeah, we're doing Agile, it doesn't mean anything. It's such a misnomer for what's going on that it's just wholly unreliable. And because your methodology can change so suddenly in the middle of an iteration, it's not really the most reliable form of measuring and practicing either. Because usually when you get to the end of a project and it's not done, somebody brings up something stupid from the Agile manifesto and says, well, we just care about being agile, and it doesn't help the company at all. It's mostly there to keep accountability off of developers when it comes time to delivery of products. And that's why I think it's the worst thing to happen to business since the housing market crash. It instead of taking everyone is winning or losing together, it says no, the developers never lose, development never loses. The company loses. But if we win, then it's only because of development. And it's really toxic. It's a really kind of crappy way of looking at things, looking at life. So I'm going to show you what the Agile Manifesto is and kind of show you what I mean here. So this is the Agile Manifesto. This was written, 2001? It didn't really take or get ground though until 2007, 2008 maybe. Anyway, so a bunch of guys got together, a bunch of leads of programming and development in the industry, and said, okay, we need to specify some things because it's often that everyone wants everything perfect, and that's just not plausible. So they said, okay, now all of these things are important, but if we're ever left in a conflict between these two things, we're going to choose this one over that one. And they all signed it and said, okay, yeah, this is the way we're going to do development. And since we're the leaders of the industry, there isn't a business person in the world who has the authority or credibility to dispute it. And so this changed the face of development afterwards. So individuals and interactions over process and tools. Now, I want to point out the psychological impact of this document from first glance here. They put in larger font. Like, this isn't my website. This is the Agile Manifesto website. They put in larger font the things that they care most about, even though they say that this doesn't have any greater value than this. But they make it more presentable in your mind, because when you first load in the page, first things that pop up are the top, the bottom, and then these middle pieces here. Not on the right side, just the left side. They want you to be thinking of these things instead of these things. So what things do they want you to be thinking of, and what things do they want you to be forgetting, even though they say they're equal? They want you to remember individuals and interactions over processes and tools, which means it doesn't matter if you're doing Agile. Agile doesn't matter. It's the process. Agile is the process. Doesn't matter. What matters? The developers matter. What matters? Interactions that you have with the developers. What doesn't matter? The tools that you would use to help out, either internal or external customers. Doesn't matter. Processes don't matter. What matters? Working software. It functions the way who wants it? The developer wants it, not the company, because the company's not making it. What doesn't matter? Comprehensive documentation. It doesn't matter if people don't know how to use it, as long as the developer does and it works. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So they're saying here that they don't want the contracts themselves to be outside of the process of development, which means they want to be directly involved with customer decision making. And I don't know if you've ever worked with a developer before, but they're not the most people friendly of persons. They just demand to have control. So control over trust. And this trust comes from trusting your business people to be business people, like they have to trust you to be a developer. Responding to change over following a plan. So if you have a model, a blueprint, and an outline, and the developer wants to change something, they want to change it more than they want to follow whatever plan they've been given, whatever blueprint they've been given. You want a house that has a 2-car garage? They want to make a 1-car garage and just extend the driveway over a bit. In their mind, the driveway option is better because they want it. Doesn't make any sense. The entirety of this is basically saying we as developers reserve the right to just not give a damn. And if you try to cross us on it, we're going to start sacrificing these things and call it Agile. It's really terrible. It's awful. As soon as this was introduced in companies that I've been in, I have immediately spoken out against it. It's a horrible practice, and it often leads to things not being delivered and people getting fired who really shouldn't have been fired, who did their job. Okay, so regardless of which methodology that you use, most of the time you'll see these associated with Agile, not so much with Waterfall. Within Waterfall, you can do these. There's no reason why you can't. It's just it takes additional time away from something that already kind of has a fixed time period on it, you know? So 2 main ways to assign work, Scrum and Kanban. So Scrum, what Scrum is, it's a means of slowly and methodically doling out work to people in a very controlled and measured environment. So like I was saying earlier, you have sprints or iterations. Scrum uses sprints and iterations. You basically say, okay, we're going to give you 2 weeks, and in these 2 weeks, we need this work done, right? The developers will go to the kind of the drawing board and start mapping out the work that needs to be done and come back with an abstract estimation. And this is where Scrum isn't necessarily favored by many business people because it relies very heavily on abstraction, and you cannot pay the bills with metaphorical currency. You cannot project success based off of dynamic variables. It just doesn't work that way. With Scrum, you basically say, okay, we need to pour the foundation for this house. How long is that going to take you? And literally, this is no joke, literally the person that is going to be working on it will say 8. and the logical response is 8 what? 8 hours, 8 days, 8 weeks, how long? And they say, no, 8. There is no unit of measurement or metric assigned to it. And at first, using this is horrible because you have no measurement. 8 means nothing at the beginning. However, as you go along, the same person could estimate that installing a door just under the hinges, not getting the deadbolt and the doorknob attached, but just installing it onto the hinges into the frame, they could say that's a 1. And you could go, oh, okay. So a door compared to a foundation is 1/8 of the work. And over time, these numbers end up indicating some sort of metric. They're never quite precisely a metric, but they're near a measurement. So if it takes you an hour to put a door up on a hinge or on its hinges, you could almost say that pouring the foundation takes 8 hours. Not quite, but it's a good association to use for metrics. And that ends up being what happens, because in the long run, business people still can't take abstractions and do estimations of profit or give confidence to shareholders over the profitability of a company with answers like, oh, we think that we're going to be an 8 this quarter. And the company goes, what the hell does that mean? Like an 8% increase, decrease? 8 what? No. 8. And it's not helpful. Over time, the 8 starts to mean something, to the point where the business person can go back and say, okay, we're going to be 2% profitable this quarter, because the previous time we said 8, we were 2% profitable. And that's kind of where it stems from, is that you give the developer the ability to not be responsible for an estimation of time, and instead you give the business person every inch of rope to hang themselves as they want. However, in order for this to be successful, it takes a lot of measurement and a lot of control. That's why you have to break things out into iterations or sprints, is so that when people are estimating, you can kind of come back over the course of several iterations and say, okay, we found out that we can do 62 units of work over this period of time. And what does that mean? Well, you estimated an 8 for this. That means we have 54 units of work left for this upcoming iteration or sprint. And then you break it down even further and say, okay, well, this person in the past, the way they estimate says that they're capable of 12 units of work. This other person, the way they estimate, says that they're capable of 6 units of work. It doesn't mean that person 1 is twice as effective. It just means that the way that they estimate makes them worth a unit of 12. It's wholly unhelpful at the beginning. It takes 3 to 6 months to establish any kind of useful metric, and usually in that time there's enough turnover in companies or in teams that whatever metric you come out to at the end is just unreliable. But a lot of people like it because it introduces a lot of control and a lot of lack of accountability. The people who end up getting hit hard for this the most are business people or management, because there's nothing to manage. It's like trying to grab a handful of cloud as you pass by while skydiving. Like actually grabbing and pulling the cloud out of the sky as you're falling. It just doesn't happen. I'm sure some people would say, oh, but it's moisture and you can get some moisture on your hand. So technically you pulled some of it out, but it's not a cloud at that point. It's moisture. I'm looking for a cloud, the actual substance of vapor. Anyway, it's just very abstract and very difficult from a direct cause and effect mentality of assigning any kind of accountability. It's anyway. Kanban is you basically say, okay, you have this like waterfall scenario, right? Where you have a bunch of work that needs to be done, and you get everyone together and you kind of figure out what aspects and pieces of work need to be done. And you write them all down on little pieces of paper like Post-its, and you put them up on the wall. And then you rearrange them to be in a logical order. And then basically what happens is that uh, everyone has said things need to happen in this order. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, all the way up. Whoever is done with their piece of work, if you imagine that their plate opens up, so now they got time for more work. Whatever is the next piece of work in line, in queue, falls onto their plate, and then they start working on that immediately. And then once the next person is done, that work moves off, and the next thing slides down. Some of the issues with this, I didn't go to the next slide. So this is kind of what Scrum is. I'll leave it here for a second. So essentially, it's something that can happen as a result is that if you have kind of a mixed specialized team of people, someone who's not as proficient in the task that's being done could end up being assigned the work. So let's say Todd, he got done with picking dandelions in the field because that was his task, because nobody can rely on Todd because Todd is the son of the guy who owns the company. And the next task that comes down is a really complicated task. Todd would pick up that task. The problem is that Todd will probably do that task wrong, and that someone else will have to spend time later fixing it. And so you can end up in a lot of scenarios where the less than desired developer ends up working on a task, and it ends up costing more in the long run. It's much easier to see the progress of work because all of the work is literally like up on a wall, physically up on a wall. And as people are getting done with things, they go up and they grab the next Post-it note, and that's how everyone knows to not work on that because it's not available anymore. And whoever physically takes off the Post-it note, it's their work. They put it on their desk, they start working on it. And that's how work gets assigned in Scrum. As you're estimating work is assigned to you based off of your estimation of it. And so if you estimate a 2 and someone else estimated a 4, and your metric for measurement is similar, they'll want you to work on it because you can do it faster than the other person. And that's kind of how work gets dished out. And it happens sprint by sprint. So you end up with like a bunch of Post-it notes. You go walking back to your desk and you say, okay, for the next 2 weeks, this is what I'm working on. And when I'm done, well, it's a different methodology in different companies. Some companies say, oh, that's your work for the 2 weeks. If you get it done in the first 3 days, then go vacation for a week. Other companies will say, oh, great, here's a huge backlog of stuff that we will never prioritize, but probably need to have happen. So work on one of those things. And that's kind of how Scrum works. You kind of get your bucket of work at the beginning. Also with Scrum, you have tons of meetings, tons. You have a pre-planning meeting, an actual planning meeting. You have meetings in the middle of an iteration to discuss the aspects of the work that you're currently doing. And then after the iteration, you have retrospective meetings to talk about everything that went right or wrong in the previous iteration while you're getting prepared for the next one. So you end up spending so much of your time in meetings um, that it becomes a bit of a hindrance to the work itself. With Kanban, you have a meeting kind of at the beginning and a meeting kind of at the end. And outside of that, there aren't too many meetings unless somebody finds like a huge, massive conflict. But outside of that, everyone knows what work has to be done. It's all been dished out and doled out to the overall board, and everyone can see the active progress of everything over time. But Kanban is following more of a waterfall mentality, and Scrum is following more of an agile mentality. It doesn't mean that you can't use one and the other. It just they seem to complement each other a little bit more. Okay, we're almost done. I know we're at 45 minutes right now, but we're almost done. Two main ways to track progress, and they're not necessarily explicit from each other, or exclusive from each other, sorry. You can use them both in tandem. In fact, it's probably best if you use them in tandem. A burn down graph is basically a linear projection for logarithmic activity. For those who aren't math people out there, it basically means that they're trying to use a straight line to measure something curved, right? Like taking a ruler and trying to measure the diameter of a basketball. And I'm not talking like a tape measure. I mean like a wooden 1-foot ruler, taking that and trying to measure a basketball. It's not the best way to do it, and you're probably going to be wrong more often than you're right. A Gantt chart, it shows the progress of several projects in tandem of each other to kind of give an overall scope or view. Burn down is great for a specific thing you're looking to get done. Gantt is great for lots of things you're trying to get done. So I'm going to show you some examples here. Burn down. Burn down, here you have your linear line, your gray line. It says, okay, based off of the velocity of the team and the projection and estimation of the cost of this piece of work, of this product or feature, here is basically how we expect progress to go, all things being equal. All things aren't equal. They almost are never equal. So what you end up having happen is that you have these points of data, and if you're looking at this from like an executive perspective or a managerial perspective, you come over here and say, okay, hours remaining versus time to the end of the milestone. And over here, you get in like 10 days, right? 10 days in, and you take a look and go, wait, we still have 150 hours of work to do, but we should only have 110 hours of work to do. We're way off. We've already lost like 40 hours of work. Why? What's been going on? What have you guys been doing in this time? And then you come over even further, and let's say you go another 10 days. And after another 10 days or 2 business work weeks, you come up and go, wait, we should be at 50 hours left. But we're not. We're at 110. The problem that we saw 10 days ago has now doubled, and it's much worse. What have you guys been doing? And usually what ends up happening is that with these kinds of products, you have a bunch of pieces that have to be folded in and incorporated at the same time. So pieces will be like 99% done, but not actually done until the last domino falls, and the last domino knocks over like 10 other dominoes. And that's when you have this kind of a line go on where people actually got done, and then it caught up to meet the line. The problem is that all during this time, for the month and a half, 2 months that you're meeting and talking about progress, this entire graph says you're way behind. Everything says you're not doing well. Everything says you're tracking incorrectly. People are wasting time. Resources aren't being appropriated properly. And it usually leads to death marches or a compromise of activity, dropping of features, and modification of expectations, which can create more work in the long run. So burn down, in my opinion, isn't a very good way of measuring or establishing progress, because you have a linear line, a linear representation of something that's logarithmic. Now, logarithmic basically means like it starts off here and it basically flatlines until it curves sharply to meet this point. It's more of a curve than a line. And as you can see, that's exactly the way it looks here. So you're using a, a linear representation to measure something that isn't linear at all. So you almost always end up with bad representation. Up until the point where the project ends, you don't know if you're doing well. You just don't. People say, well, it's good to know this ahead of time. It's not. It's really not. You end up making panicked decisions, trying to compromise on things that really don't need to be compromised on, and you end up delivering something much worse than what you could have if you had held your ground. Gantt chart. So a Gantt chart, a burn down is basically for an individual product or a feature of that product. A Gantt chart is for many products or many features of a given project. Okay, so you can see here that they basically say that given resources and time, because time is a resource, but given resources over time, we expect that all these products will work out in this fashion. Okay, you have all these tasks, and here is the end of the project when everything needs to be done by. So we've laid things out like this, thinking that once resources become available here, these resources are then going to be disseminated to everything else that's left. And you can see here that the gray means done and blue means outstanding, right? And so here you got something that's in progress. It's not done. This one's done, like this one here on line 13 is it's like somewhere in here. So if you drill down into it and look at the burn down for this specific task, you might panic and go, we're never going to make it. But if you take a step back into the Gantt chart and say, okay, we still have a lot of time, we still have a lot of resources, there's no reason to panic right now, you can save yourself a lot of hassle and a lot of unnecessary moving and shifting of things around. But yeah, this is just a very nice way of showing overall progress for very large things. And I really like Gantt charts. Gantt charts, I think, are very helpful because they don't provide too much information. Too much information can almost always lead to, or almost always does lead to, bad interpretations. Which is usually why when I'm asked for a report, I will give estimations of the accuracy of the report as I hand it in, to try to dissuade the overinterpretation of data. So this is the conclusion. So we're at the end. We're just shy of an hour. The conclusion is that being familiar with the different methodologies is good practice, but it's like reading the instructions for a board game. If you don't play the game, it's really hard to understand how the game is meant to be played. It doesn't matter how many times you read through the instructions. Even two companies that are using the same named methodology, like Waterfall, will do Waterfall in a very different way. So, having the idea and the theory of it in a partially understood manner is good, because without it, it's like trying to play a game without reading the rules or having anyone explain it to you. Like imagine sitting down to play Dungeons and Dragons without anyone ever explaining anything or you reading anything. You just sit down, you pick up a character sheet, and you just start writing random crap in other places and trying to play. It's going to throw everyone off. It's going to be really confusing, and people are going to know really quickly you don't belong there. However, having the kind of idea and theory about how things work will make it easy to start putting things into place as you come across them. And even at new companies will say, oh, we do Agile, and I'll show up and find out they're not actually doing Agile. It's Waterfall, but they call it Agile because, again, Agile says it can. After I've identified that, I can start modifying the way I interact with people and the way that I approach work, because it very much so is a work ethic. of spending a lot of time in meetings versus leaving people alone, or trying to get extra involved in design meetings so I can try to give some insight as to how things are probably going to be tested in the future, or as we progress with it. Um, Understanding the theory helps to build on the actual, but you can't actually understand or appreciate the theory until you've used it. So it's not really a chicken and egg scenario per se, um, but it's close. It is very close. So understanding the terms, understanding the ideas behind them are good. Um, Trying to use something like this or anything that anyone else would show to you without actually being in a company using it is never going to be enough. So try to learn the methodologies, look up, Google some examples of the different kinds of methodologies, or the way that things are looked at. If you find something and you have questions, send me what you looked up and your questions, and I'll be happy to break it down for you and kind of show you what means what and why and how I know that and things like that. For today, that's kind of your homework, is to go through, look up all of the different forms um, of development cycles and methodologies. And if you come across anything that you just don't understand that doesn't look like anything that I've represented here, send it to me and we'll discuss it at length. Um, anyway, I just want to wrap up right now. Next time, let me get this document back open. I did not want to open Spotify, but it's going to open. There we go. The next time we're going to go over test case management. I'm probably going to write up a few test cases to kind of give you some examples of different stylings, and kind of show you some long-term and short-term examples of test case management. I don't know when I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to get this video out tonight, on the 11th of April, and I will maybe do the next one tomorrow on the 12th, but I'm not entirely certain. I'm not gonna lie, I had a lot of motivation for this yesterday. I haven't had a lot of it today, but I felt like I needed to get something done today, because so far I've just been watching Dexter and not doing a whole heck of a lot, and that's not the best. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been informative. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it hasn't been too soapboxy for you. But please stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, and um, always seek to gain your own understanding and opinion of things. Thank you so much. We'll see you.